Yes, they do. They say MSG is a salt of glutamate, monosodium glutamate. It's not the sodium that's causing the problem, it's the glutamate. So if they break down the protein and they have a high concentration of glutamate, no, it's not MSG, but it's glutamate. It's the glutamate that's the excitotoxin. In nature, the way God planned things is that proteins are to be broken down slowly in your system. Then your body utilizes it very slowly and it doesn't build up into your blood or your brain. We weren't meant to eat hydrolyzed, broken down protein and free amino acids. Our body doesn't know how to handle that. So when you consume monosodium glutamate, your blood levels can reach 20-fold higher than normal. A brain doesn't know how to handle 20-fold higher normal monosodium glutamate. Neither does the liver, the muscles, or the other organ systems. It wasn't designed that way. Now let's look at, I'm going to give you something that you're probably going to hate, but this is just the physiology of the excitotoxic process. What goes on in a nerve cell when it's exposed to excitotoxins? But this just gives you kind of an overview. Now first, there are a lot of diseases and disorders that are associated with excitotoxicity, and this list is growing every day. They're finding more and more diseases that have anything to do with the brain is associated with excitotoxicity. It seems to be a central process in a lot of different diseases. And this is what we're finding out throughout medicine, is that there's just simple, central things that are causing a wide spectrum of disease. What makes the difference between one disease and another, whether it's cancer or Alzheimer's disease or arthritis, is the excitotoxicity is producing it in different tissues. We know that head injuries, if you injure your head, what happens is, we've known for some time that most of the damage that happens to your brain in the head injury doesn't happen at the time of the injury. That does happen, but usually not. It's delayed several hours. And we've gone through all kinds of contortions trying to figure out what is this delayed damage and how can we stop it. Well, now they've discovered it's excitotoxicity. Because when your brain is injured, it releases glutamate from itself, because normally glutamate is a transmitter in the brain. It's the most common transmitter in the brain. But it's carefully, carefully regulated. When you injure your brain, it can't regulate it anymore, and it builds up a high level in your brain and produces the delayed injury that frequently results in severe neurological injury or death. Strokes. When you have a stroke and block off a blood vessel that's going to the brain, it isn't the lack of blood supply that causes the worst part of the stroke. That just kills a little tiny core of brain tissue. Around that tiny core, the brain starts secreting enormously large amounts of excitotoxins. And that's what causes the devastating aspect of a stroke. If we block those excitotoxins, the stroke is much, much less. And you can do that with something that God created called food. Hypoglycemic brain damage. When your blood sugar falls extremely low and people go into a coma or die, it's not because the brain cells are starved for glucose. It's because when they're starved for glucose, they release a lot of glutamate, and the glutamate kills the brain cell. AIDS dementia has recently been shown to be caused by excitotoxicity. Migraine headaches are caused by it. Anytime your nervous system is infected with a virus or bacteria, it causes the brain to secrete large amounts of glutamate, and that's what does the damage. Seizures are caused by glutamate excess, excitotoxicity. Most of your seizure drugs, anti-seizure drugs, block glutamate. All of these different things, degenerative brain disease, Parkinson's, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, the hottest area of research is the death of the brain cells by glutamate. It can cause immune suppression, episodic violence, and learning disorders. Now, if you look at a typical brain cell, you have the cell body, or the main part of the cell, and you have this long process called an axon, and at this end looks like a spiny tree in the winter. This is the dendrite. This is where all the different connections are made in the brain. They connect each other. And dotted on here, you see these little squares here. That's the receptors. That's where glutamate attaches to send the signals down the nerve cell. So glutamate is normal in the brain. It's the most common transmitter, as I said, and its function is to carry information from one brain cell to the next so your brain will work. And it carries out almost everything that you can think of in your brain is somehow connected to glutamate neurotransmitter. Now, this is the neurodegenerative process, and basically this is what is the central process for all those diseases I listed about excitotoxicity. That whole long list, this is what happens. And this is similar to what happens in cancer, surprisingly, and arthritis. We're finding that everything is a central mechanism. But in the brain, there's one little difference, and that has to do with this membrane here. It has a little pore in it, a little opening, a channel. This is microscopic. You can only see that on an electron microscope. And what this does is this little pore opens and closes. And glutamate controls the opening and closing of that little pore. Normally, there's very little glutamate outside of that brain cell. I mean, absolutely minute amounts, in millionths of a mole, okay? And it has to be that way, because if that level rises, it'll kill that brain cell. So your brain goes to a lot of trouble to make sure that glutamate level outside that nerve cell never gets above that 10 to 12 millionths of a mole. And it does that by a process where anytime glutamate's out there, it combines with a special transport protein, and that whisks it away and puts it in a cell called an astrocyte and stores it there until it's needed. Only when you're going to have a transmission of an impulse will it release it, and when it does, it breaks loose of the transport protein, attaches to its receptor, opens up the hole, and calcium pours into your cell. And then it whisked away again, and the hole closes. So it's only open for a millionth of a second, just enough to let a few molecules of calcium in. Once that calcium is in, it starts triggering these processes. And these processes normally, if it's just a little bit of calcium, what it does, it makes the nerve fire its impulse. If something happens and there's too much glutamate, it opens that hole up for too long, too much calcium gets in. If too much calcium gets in, then too intense of a reaction of these different processes take place, and it'll produce an inflammatory reaction in that cell with these inflammatory chemicals. It'll produce what we call free radicals, which are just very toxic chemicals that bounce around the cell, oxidizing all the components of the cell. One of the components that really damages is what we call the mitochondria, and that's the little part of your cell that produces almost all the energy that you use for everything, whether it's walking, moving, thinking. Mitochondria supplies the energy for everything. These free radicals generated by too much calcium damages that mitochondria, so it can no longer produce its energy the way it's supposed to. If it can't produce enough energy, the cell dies. It activates a gene called a p53 gene, which is the suicide gene in your cell. Cells are pretty smart. God made them that way. If this cell is damaged too bad by all these processes, and the cell knows that it cannot survive, it'll activate that gene and go ahead and kill itself. We call that apoptosis. And that's what too much calcium coming in will do. We also know that some of these products build up, they'll inhibit this transport protein so that more glutamate will start building up. So it's a kind of a cyclic process that just keeps going until the cell dies. Now, note with the knowledge that if too much glutamate out here is toxic, and it doesn't take a lot to make it toxic, does it make a lot of sense to add it to your food? Knowing that it transfers through the blood-brain barrier and will enter the brain, which we have proof of. Now, when we look at excitotoxin sensitivity, three things we see that are very important. One is that human is 5 times more sensitive than the next most sensitive life form on Earth, the mouse. And we're really 20 times more sensitive than a rhesus monkey. Newborn babies are 4 times more sensitive than adults. So if you're pregnant and you're eating food that contains a lot of MSG, that is passed through the placenta into the baby and damages the baby's brain at a time that brain is being formed. And they're 4 times more sensitive than an adult would be. Why are the babies so sensitive to MSG? It's because their brain enzymes that normally protect them are immature. They haven't formed yet. Their blood-brain barrier is immature. It hasn't completely formed yet. And babies and toddlers frequently become hypoglycemic, which magnifies excitotoxicity. Now, what do these excitotoxins do inside of the nervous system once they get in there? Well, we know that they can actually alter how the brain forms. That's what's so bad about the little children. We know that when the mother is pregnant, during that last trimester and during the first 4 years after birth is when most of the brain is forming. All these little pathways have to connect, and they have to connect in a certain way. All these dendrites are growing and branching. These synaptic connections are taking place. And that is very sensitive to glutamate. Too much, it destroys these pathways or make them grow in the wrong direction. We know they can destroy certain groups or collections of these brain cells called these nuclei, like the arcuate nucleus, ventral medial nucleus, or the hypothalamus. It can destroy it. This nucleus is the most sensitive area of the entire brain. It was interesting during the hearings on the toxicity of glutamate, one of the neuroscientists that was working for the glutamate producers made this statement, well, so what if it destroys the arcuate nucleus? We don't know whether it does anything or not. But at the time, we knew the arcuate nucleus was a very important nucleus in the brain. It's very vital. Another interesting thing is that less than toxic doses, that is, a dose that won't kill a cell, will alter its physiology. It'll make the cell overreact, so if it's a cell secreting hormones, they'll secrete too much hormones. If it's one that has to do with consciousness, it may cloud the consciousness. If it affects memory and it's overstimulated, it may alter your ability to remember. One of the ways that excitotoxins kill is by producing free radicals. Excitotoxins are very powerful free radical generators. They make these cells produce all these destructive free radicals that destroy the cells. And one of the interesting things we found out not too long ago is that it impairs the ability of glucose to enter the brain. The brain is almost totally dependent on glucose for its energy supply. Glutamate interferes with the entry of that fuel to the brain. So when you're consuming a diet high in MSG, it interferes with the ability of your brain to get the fuel it needs. Now, let's look at the MSG babies. These were the animals that were first exposed to glutamate. They all had certain characteristics that is repeatable, and this has been repeated ever since this first was discovered. This has been done over and over. We find that the organ weights of the animals are very small. It causes atrophy, a shrinking of various organs. The ovaries, testes, adrenal glands, kidney, spleen, pituitary, they all are smaller than normal, significantly smaller. We find that the animals were all grossly obese. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but the obesity is similar to what we're seeing in human society now. With this growth, we're talking about of adolescent obesity, where all the kids are real obese, and it's difficult to control, and a lot of the adults are finding trouble controlling their obesity. We find that it's almost impossible to diet off this type of obesity, and it's almost impossible to exercise at all, because it alters the part of the brain that has to do with obesity. Abnormal reproductive functions are very common with MSG toxicity in these babies. When they become adults, they have very small litters. And this is true even for the males. If you expose the males to MSG, they become infertile or have difficulty procreating. We find that MSG is frequently associated with unprovoked rage, overt aggression, and antisocial behavior. This is almost always consistent in these MSG-exposed babies. And I'm not just talking about while they're a baby. This is when they become adults. This lasts the entire lifetime of the animal. When the animal gets older, it's filled with rage. It won't associate with the other animals. Impaired cardiovascular responsiveness. You know, when you run, your heart speeds up. Well, that's impaired. It doesn't quite work that way anymore. We find that animals that are exposed to MSG have very high triglyceride levels, cholesterol, and very low density lipoproteins. And this persists for a lifetime. This puts them at high risk of having heart attacks and strokes, arteriosclerosis. Abnormal hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that is how the endocrine system works, is permanently altered in these animals. So we see some rather devastating effects to exposing animals when they're babies. Now, this is reproducible